In terms of viral infections, some of the most common are listed here, and we'll talk about a few of them. Herpes is one, of course, that a lot of people talk about. There are two forms, oral and genital herpes, caused by herpes simplex virus 1 and 2. And they're found worldwide in anywhere between 60 and 95% of adults. In the US, that number is estimated to be closer to 25%. About 1/4 of the US adults population is estimated to have oral or genital herpes. Now, a lot of people like to make a distinction. Oh, well, it's just oral herpes. It's not the same thing. And the challenge with that is that they kind of can be the same thing. Just because, it's a lesion on the mouth doesn't mean that it could not lead to a lesion in the genitals. And just because somebody has a lesion in the genitals doesn't mean that it won't necessarily cause a lesion on the mouth. We tend to, and I put them in this order, oral and genital, we tend to think of herpes simplex 1 as being the oral form of herpes. And we tend to think of herpes simplex 2 as being the genital form of herpes. And so a lot of times when people talk about herpes, what they mean is genital. They don't really talk about oral. They're not talking about like cold sores. Cold sores are even more common. Like the oral form is more common than the genital form, even in the US. I think they said it's something like 50% of US adults have the oral form, but like 1/4 might have the genital form. But it can go both ways, but that just tends to be most common. The general symptom of herpes that most patients are going to report is painful recurrent blistering, especially around the mouth for oral herpes or the genitals for genital herpes. The blisters will come and go. Herpes actually comes from, I believe it's Greek, meaning to creep. So it comes and goes. But the patient can still be contagious even if they don't have active blisters. Now, we have some really good antiviral therapies that can reduce the number of outbreaks, reduce the severity of outbreaks, and can make it so that patients, when they are not having an outbreak, actually are not really contagious. However, we worry a lot about our immune-compromised individuals and our neonates. A neonate that gets herpes, it causes meningitis and encephalitis, and those infants often die. So it's really critical. Don't kiss the baby. But if a mother is experiencing an active herpes outbreak at the time of childbirth, they will do as much as they can to prevent contact between the child and the lesions. So it's a really important thing to think about. Another viral sexually transmitted infection is cytomegalovirus. This one is super common. One of my doctors told me that they estimate like 80% of people in the US have this. This number says between 60 and 100%. Yeah, she told me 80, whatever. It falls between 60 and 80. Depends on where you are in the world, how many people are infected. So I guess maybe 80 is her estimate for US, 100 in other countries. This is the leading infectious cause of birth defects. And so I believe that one of the articles I have you read is about cytomegalovirus. So hopefully you learn a little bit more about it from that article. This, in an otherwise healthy individual, not a huge concern, but in an immune-compromised individual, which does include a neonate, big deal. And it is implicated in causing certain cancers later in life. So even though I don't have this on the same slide as the herpes that cause the oral and genital herpes, cytomegalovirus is a type of herpes. It is a herpes virus. It's very closely related. And so is chickenpox, but we'll get there. Human papillomavirus, or HPV, causes warts. There are over 170 types. 40 of them can cause human disease, and some of those can cause sexually transmitted infections, where again, warts are the most common clinical presentation. The reason that we talk a lot about human papillomavirus is because it is one of the viruses that we call oncogenic. It causes cancer. In fact, 99% or more of all cervical cancers are thought to be caused by HPV. When the patients have their cells tested, they are positive for HPV. HPV is the second leading cause of oral cancer behind tobacco use. It can also cause anal cancer, penile cancer, vulvar cancer, vaginal cancer, not just cervical cancer. So it causes a lot of different kinds of cancer. There are 2 vaccines that exist. They are highly effective against the most common and most dangerous strains. And, one of the things that's really frustrating as a scientist is I know that these vaccines exist. And I know that these vaccines can prevent the development of cancer. These are like basically cancer vaccines. But again, there's that stigma of, human papillomavirus is a sexually transmitted infection. And I kid you not, again, when I was a little bit younger, but not that young, when these vaccines were first introduced, people would get on the news, and especially politicians and stuff, they would get on the news and be like, well, we can't have our children get this vaccine because then they'll have sex. I'm like, okay, they're probably going to have sex anyway, regardless of whether or not they get this vaccine. And this vaccine is not a vaccine that makes people go sexually crazy. It prevents cancer. So it's that idea of you taking a GE class like this that helps you speak to why we need these vaccines and what the point is. So, if you've not been vaccinated against HPV, it is recommended, especially if you're sexually active. I suppose if you're not, then that's okay. But the vaccine generally is given to children right as they enter their teen years, between the ages of 12 and 15, before they would become sexually active, hopefully. But the FDA, I think now allows people up to the age of 45. I'm not quite there yet. I'm not 45, but the vaccine was introduced when I was older than the target age. And so they've kind of opened it up and said, hey, if you haven't gotten it yet, come get it. So you can still go get it. HIV is the final viral STI that we'll talk about. It was first officially recognized in the US in 1981, but most scientists believe that it was in the US, not just believe, have evidence that the virus was in the US in the late 1960s. So it has been in the US a lot longer than we thought it was, but it was in the early 1980s that people really started dying of it in the US, and it really brought it to the forefront. Recent results have suggested that HIV jumped into people in the 1920s in Kinshasa, which is now in the Democratic Republic of Congo, through the consumption of primates, non-human primates. So people who eat non-human primates, they call it bushmeat. Non-human primates get a very similar form of a virus called simian immunodeficiency virus, or SIV. So it's thought that in the 1920s, it was able to mutate just enough to jump into people, and then it did. In the US, they first called it the gay-related immune deficiency because they noticed that in the homosexual male community, they were the ones most affected. They started calling it the 4-H Club a little bit after that, where it affected homosexuals, hemophiliacs, heroin users, and Haitians, because Haiti had a high level of HIV. Heroin users share needles. Hemophiliacs have to get blood transplants. And then, of course, the homosexuals. They used the term AIDS, acquired immune deficiency syndrome, in 1982, and the virus was isolated and identified in the mid-1980s. So there's a lot of, you could do a whole lecture on the history of HIV. It's very interesting, and it's very important to talk about, but nobody wanted to talk about it at the time. But now we know, and so we know what happens is that during the early stage of infection, a patient is exposed to the virus, develops the infection, they will most likely have flu-like symptoms within 2 to 4 weeks of acquiring the infection, and then they'll be fine, sometimes for years. Eventually what it does is it causes the immune system to collapse. It attacks a very specific type of cell in the immune system called a helper T cell, a CD4, CD, like the letter CD, 4 positive T cell, that are absolutely critical for running your immune response. So it shuts down your whole immune system. And what tends to be seen in patients with HIV that eventually progresses to AIDS is they start to get these weird infections that normally don't make people sick, especially adults. They'll get things like thrush, which is a fungal infection in the mouth that you typically only see in kids. They'll get tuberculosis. Their herpes will come back. They'll get shingles from having had chicken pox. Anything can make them sick, and that's usually how they die, of a random infection that they got. HIV prevalence, it is most common in sub-Saharan Africa, but you see that it is spread worldwide with varying levels of incidence. It can be diagnosed through blood tests. Treatment includes a lifelong course of antiretroviral therapy. So HIV is a special type of virus called a retrovirus, and so there are drugs that target that. But as far as we know, it's not a cure. Like, once you've had it, taking those drugs doesn't cure you of the infection. There have only been a handful of people worldwide who have ever been cured of HIV, and they received bone marrow transplants. So to do a bone marrow transplant, you kill the whole immune system. So it kills the whole immune system, which of course would get rid of the virus, and then give them a healthy immune system back through the bone marrow of somebody else. And you might be thinking, well, then why don't we do that for all HIV patients? And there are a few reasons. One, it's very dangerous. People who get bone marrow transplants can sometimes just die of having their immune system wiped out. Two, it's very difficult to find a donor. You have to find a donor who is compatible. When you have patients, like, let's just use the US as an example. When you have HIV patients who are minorities, and unfortunately, we tend to see higher levels of HIV in racial and ethnic minorities, it's harder to find a donor because there are fewer people who are qualified to be a donor. You're most likely to find a donor within your own race. So if you're white, a white donor. If you're Hispanic, a Hispanic donor. If you're black, a black donor, right? You're more likely to find a compatible donor that way. If you are mixed race, especially if perhaps that mix is more of an uncommon mixed race, you have to find somebody who's mixed race. So it can be very challenging to find a donor. And finally, it's very expensive. If you don't have health insurance, which a lot of people don't, the cost of a bone marrow transplant is estimated to be anywhere from $500,000 to $1 million. And most people don't have that, especially most people with HIV. Because unfortunately, most people with HIV, we tend to see, are of a lower socioeconomic status. There are several vaccines in clinical trials and expected to enter clinical trials soon. So hopefully our discussion of HIV will be of why you should be getting the vaccine rather than how to protect yourself. To move into a parasitic infection, we have trichomoniasis. It's caused by a parasite called Trichomonas vaginalis. This is what it looks like. So these are different from bacteria. They have a nucleus. They are eukaryotic cells. It's a very common sexually transmitted infection. It's estimated to cause approximately 5 million cases per year. It is not, however, reportable to the CDC. The CDC is kind of like, yeah, whatever. So it's pretty common, but you don't report it to the CDC. Generally asymptomatic. However, in patients who do experience symptoms, it generally causes a copious discharge. The discharge is supposed to be like a yellowish green color. and it smells. And I know you're like, okay, why are you telling us this? It's not that I've had the infection. I worked in a lab when I was doing my master's degree on a campus where another lab worked on this this parasite. And I remember one day I was walking to my teaching lab. I was teaching a genetics lab, and the lab where they researched this parasite was right down the hall, and I like physically walked into the smell. I could feel it like in my body. It was like hitting a wall, and it was the most horrible thing I've ever smelled in my whole life. I don't think I've ever smelled anything that bad since. I literally like bent over at the waist. I was like dry heaving. It smelled horrible. And my friend popped her head out of the lab because she worked in the lab. Hey, what are you doing? I was like, I'm trying not to puke. What's going on? Oh yeah, we're just growing. And they were growing like liters of it. I'm like, why? Why are you doing that? Well, that's why we do it at night, because nobody's here. And I'm like, well, I teach from 8 to 11, so I'm here. Please, on Wednesday nights, could you not grow this parasite? And they were like, yeah, okay. It's horrible. So if you do have the smell, you would know. But again, because it's generally asymptomatic, this is why it is recommended to periodically get screened for sexually transmitted infections. And this would be included on the screening. In patients who are pregnant that have the infection, it can cause low birth weight or premature birth, which is dangerous for the neonate, and it can increase the predisposition to HIV. Treatment is available with a drug called metronidazole. However, resistant strains are becoming increasingly common. And that's the reason, we want to get rid of these infections. We don't want them going around anymore, because if they start to become resistant, then we're really out of luck. So the viral and parasitic infection that I've just talked about, just like with the bacterial infections, can be prevented mostly through the use of condoms. So the use of a barrier can be very, very protective. The last one we'll talk about are pubic lice. So pubic lice are, it's a species of louse. It's an insect. Sometimes people call them crabs. They're not crabs, they're lice. Crabs are different. But that's what people call, like colloquially, the pubic lice. This is what they look like. Like all lice, they'll kind of grab onto the hairs. But they are a different species than head lice, and they are a different species than body lice. They're generally found in pubic hair, though they can be found on your eyelashes, and that's a special kind of not because they're pubic lice that I'm so grossed out they'd be on my eyelashes, but because lice on my eyelashes sounds horrifying no matter what kind of lice they are. So thankfully I've not experienced that yet. Symptoms include itching, fever, and infection. They're not known to really transmit disease, but because they cause itching, you can scratch, and those scratches can get infected. If one family member is infected, they are likely to transmit it to the rest of the family. Obviously not through sexual contact unless it's the parents, but through clothing, bedding, etc. The lice can get onto the clothing or onto bedding and kind of persist in that area and then spread throughout the house. Over-the-counter treatments are available, just like with head lice. You go get the I don't remember what it's called, but there are the over-the-counter shampoos and things like that for head lice. Those generally also work for pubic lice. You can also remove the hair. If you don't have the hair, they don't have anything to grab onto, so it's easier to get rid of them. It's the same thing for head lice. If you shave your head, you can get rid of your head lice, but most people don't want to shave their head. But to remove the pubic hair can get rid of the pubic lice. Now, I told you when we finished up talking about the parasites that condom use can prevent the transmission of the parasites, but the condom use does not prevent transmission of pubic lice. Because the condom only covers the penis, it doesn't cover the pubic hair, so the pubic hair can transmit to the sexual partner. And vice versa, if the sexual partner has pubic lice, the pubic hair of the person wearing the condom is unprotected, and so the pubic lice can spread that way.